welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie and I appreciate y'all stopping by. Today I'll be showing how I made these 6 creative, fun, and easy fall pumpkins. I hope y'all enjoy the video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let's go ahead and jump into DIY number 1. For this project, I used one of these wire pumpkin wreath forms from Dollar Tree and some of this wool yarn from Walmart in the color oatmeal. I started by wrapping the entire frame of the wreath, including the stem, with the oatmeal colored yarn, using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. Once I had the frame completely wrapped, I flipped the pumpkin over and started filling in the center. I placed a dab of hot glue on each point where the yarn was going to be in contact with the frame and placed the yarn on top to adhere it to the wreath. I continued to add rows of the yarn until I had the entire center of the pumpkin covered. If there were any large gaps between the rows, I added a small amount of hot glue to adhere the 2 pieces of yarn together. After I had the center of the pumpkin filled, I went back and trimmed all the edges and loose pieces of yarn. Then, to decorate the pumpkin, I used these scrap pieces of fall florals that I had left over in my stash. I placed the largest floral piece first, placing one of the stems through the stem of the pumpkin, and used hot glue to secure it in place. Next, I placed the brown colored berries just below the stem and used hot glue to secure them in place. Finally, I placed the cream colored berries right under the brown berries and secured them in place with hot glue. To finish off this wreath, I made a simple shoestring bow using more of the yarn and used hot glue to secure it to the top of the pumpkin right under the stem to cover up where I attached the floral pieces. I absolutely love how this pumpkin wreath turned out. This is my first time using one of these wreath forms, and this is hands down one of my all-time favorite wreaths that I have ever created. Moving on to DIY number 2. For this project, I used one of these 11.9-inch cocoa liners that I picked up at Lowe's. I started by placing the cocoa liner onto a piece of scrap cardboard and traced around the top, then cut it out with a pair of scissors. Once I had the cardboard cut to size, I placed some hot glue around the edges of the cardboard and placed it right inside the top of the cocoa liner to create the back of the pumpkin. After I had the cocoa liner adhered to the cardboard, I went around and trimmed up any of the liner that was hanging over the edge. Next, I used 1.5 packs of this nautical rope from Dollar Tree. I used hot glue to attach the nautical rope around the outside edge of the cocoa liner to give it a nice finished look. I also used hot glue to attach 5 additional strips of the nautical rope to the front of the cocoa liner to create the sections of the pumpkin. Then I used folk art paint in the color Pueblo to paint the entire pumpkin front and back with one coat. I used 2 of these brown paper bags from Dollar Tree to create the pumpkin stem. I used a spray bottle to spray a little bit of water on the fronts and backs of both paper sacks, and then twisted the 2 sacks together in the shape of a stem and cut off any excess paper from the bottom. Once I was happy with the way the stem looked, I applied a generous amount of Mod Podge to the stem and set it aside to dry for a couple of hours. After the stem was completely dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Truffle to paint the entire stem. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Hazelnut and a stencil brush and heavily dry brushed over the entire stem. Here is how the stem turned out once it was painted and dry. I used a generous amount of hot glue on the bottom of the stem, then placed it down on top of the pumpkin in the center and wrapped the bottom part of the stem over the edges and held it in place while the glue set up. I then used hot glue to attach some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree to the top of the pumpkin around the stem. Next, I used some of this green fern-like foliage from Dollar Tree. I removed 2 sets of leaves from the pick and arranged them so that the top leaves were facing in opposite directions, then used hot glue to attach the 2 sets of leaves together. Then I used more hot glue to adhere the set of leaves to the top left side of the pumpkin stem. I then repeated this step to create another set of leaves and hot glued them to the top right side of the stem. Finally, I used hot glue to attach a single leaf to the front of the pumpkin facing away from the stem. Next, I used one of these white wooden tags from Hobby Lobby and this pumpkin stencil I had in my stash. I taped the stencil to the front of the tag and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink along with a round sponge brush to lightly stencil the pumpkin onto the tag. Once the paint was dry, I used a finger sander to distress the entire tag. Then, to finish up this project, I replaced the jute hanger on the tag and tied it around the stem of the pumpkin. I'm not sure how exactly I feel about this particular pumpkin. It is definitely different, and I was going for a more primitive look with this one, and I think on that front I succeeded. Let me know what you think about this pumpkin in the comments. Let's move on to DIY number 3. For this project, I used 2 of these light-up pumpkins from Dollar Tree. I started by cutting out the light fixture from the bottom of both pumpkins. I then removed the mesh coverings from the pumpkins so that I was left with only the wire frame. I also used some of these corn husks that I picked up in the grocery section at Walmart. I placed several of the corn husks into a pan with super hot water that I had boiled on the stove. I used this wreath dye in the color Sunshine Orange from Hobby Lobby to dye these corn husk orange. I shook up the bottle really well, then poured a generous amount into the pan with the corn husk. I made sure to stir the dye into the water and that all the corn husks were completely submerged. I then let them sit in the dye for about 30 minutes, stirring them occasionally. Once the corn husk had been in the dye for 30 minutes, I used gloves and carefully removed them from the water, setting them on a baking sheet lined with foil and paper towels, and then let them dry overnight. I then repeated these steps using wreath dye in the color dark green on a few more of the corn husk. Again, placing them in super hot water, letting them soak for 30 minutes, removing them and allowing them to dry overnight. I also repeated these steps using this wreath dye in the color cocoa brown on just a few of the corn husk. They didn't have the brown dye in a liquid, so I used this powder form and followed the directions on the box. Again, I let all these corn husks dry overnight. While I was waiting on the corn husks to dry, I went ahead and used some wire cutters to remove all the small wire sections of the pumpkin frame. This way I was left with only the 6 large wire sections. Once the orange corn husks were completely dry, I used hot glue to attach them to the pumpkin frame. I started attaching them between the wires using hot glue to attach the widest end of the corn husk to the bottom of the frame. I then used hot glue to attach the pointed end of the corn husk to the top of the frame. After I had the corn husk attached to the top and bottom of the pumpkin, I went back and used hot glue on the 2 bottom edges of the husk and wrapped them around the wires. I continued to attach the corn husk around the pumpkin between the wired sections until I had all the empty spaces covered. Next, I started attaching the corn husk to the pumpkin, placing them over the wire frames and allowing them to overlap the corn husk that is between the wires. This time, after I had the corn husk attached to the bottom of the pumpkin, I cut the corners of the husk at an angle to get rid of the excess husk. I then repeated these steps to attach the rest of the corn husk around the pumpkin until I had all the wires covered except for the stem and the hole in the very bottom. Here is how the pumpkin looked once I had all the orange corn husk in place. Next, I took some scissors and cut any of the husks that were hanging over the edge at the bottom of the pumpkin so that I could replace the lot. I used one of the brown corn husks to create the stem by rolling it on itself to create a cone and cutting off the excess husk, then used hot glue so that it would hold its shape. I did go ahead and fold the top of the stem in so that it looked finished. To attach the stem to the frame, I applied some hot glue to the wire stem and around the base, then slipped the corn husk stem over the wire stem. Next, I took a dark green husk and cut out a small leaf shape and hot glued it right under the stem on the side of the pumpkin. I also took a small strip of the green husk, twisted it around a pencil, and used a heat tool to heat it up just enough so that it held its shape to create a tendril. I then used hot glue to attach the tendril right behind the stem. Then, to finish up this pumpkin, I placed some hot glue around the inside edges of the light fixture and placed it back inside the bottom of the pumpkin. I repeated these steps to cover the other pumpkin, only this time I removed all the large wire sections from the frame to make this one a little bit smaller. I also just used the natural colored corn husk with a brown stem, green leaf, and green tendril. I am pretty happy with the way these light up pumpkins turned out. I think they are a fun twist on the traditional pumpkin. I would like to take a second to talk about today's video. It's part of the Pumpkin Spice and Everything Nice playlist, hosted by Amanda from 6 Kids and a Glue Gun and Katie from Lady Red Crafting. I was honored when these ladies asked me to co-host this playlist because, as many of y'all may know, fall is my absolute favorite time of the year to craft. Both of these ladies are talented crafters and have some amazing DIY projects. So if you haven't checked them out, I highly encourage you to do so. I just know you're going to love their channels. I'll link their channels in the description box below, as well as leave a link to the playlist so you can get even more fun pumpkin decor inspiration once you finish this video. With that said, let's move on to DIY number 4. For this project, I used one of these children's hula skirts from Dollar Tree. I started by removing 6 pieces of the raffia from the skirt. I tied one end of the raffia in a knot and taped it down to the table using a couple pieces of Scotch tape. I then braided the raffia together using 2 pieces in each section. I continued braiding until I had a braided piece that was about 8.5 inches long. Once I had it to the appropriate length, I tied the other end in a knot and cut off the excess raffia. I then repeated this step until I had a total of 10 pieces of the braided raffia. Next, I added a small dab of hot glue on one of the ends of the strips and glued the 2 ends together to create a circle. I repeated this step until I had 10 circles. To assemble the pumpkin, I applied some hot glue on the section of the circle where the 2 knots were glued together and placed one of the other circles up against it, also where it was glued together. I then continued to add 7 more circles to the center of the pumpkin until I had a total of 8 sections on the pumpkin, making sure to keep all the sections where the circles were glued together in the middle. I found it easiest to place the circles directly across from one another until I had the basic shape of a pumpkin, then went back and filled in any large gaps. I used some floral wire and wrapped it around the center of the pumpkin close to the top, and another piece of floral wire close to the bottom to help secure all the braided raffia pieces in place. Next, I used the 2 extra pieces of braided raffia and used hot glue to wrap it around the center of the pumpkin to cover up the floral wire. Here is how the body of the pumpkin looked once I had it completely assembled. To create the stem of the pumpkin, I braided 6 more of the raffia pieces together to create a longer braid and used hot glue to secure it to itself until I was happy with the size of the stem. Once I was happy with the size of the stem, I cut off the excess braid and used a small dab of hot glue at the top to tuck the end pieces inside for a nice finished look. I then used more hot glue to attach the stem to the top of the pumpkin, and this one is finished. I went ahead and made a larger pumpkin by using 15 pieces of raffia per braid and braiding them to 13 inches long and repeating the previous steps to put the pumpkin together. These little pumpkins did take a little bit of time due to the braiding process, but I think they turned out really cute and will be the perfect addition to my fall porch display. Alright, on to DIY number 5. For this project, I used one of these wire pumpkin wreath forms from Dollar Tree and some of these brown paper bags. I started by cutting the very bottom off of the paper bag and then cut the bag open so that I had one solid long piece of paper. I then repeated this step until I had several strips of brown paper. Once I had all the bags cut, I took one of the strips and loosely twisted it. I then used hot glue to attach the top of the strip to the wreath form and then twisted it around the wire frame and secured the bottom of the strip to the wreath form with more hot glue. I then repeated this step until I had all the wire strips on the wreath form covered. If one strip of paper wasn't long enough to cover the wire strip of the wreath form, I used hot glue to attach 2 of the bags together and cut off the excess bag once I had it wrapped around the wire and secured into place. Here is how the wreath form looked once I had all the wires covered with the paper. After I had all the strips attached to each of the wires, I started adding more of the paper bag strips in between each of them to completely fill in the wreath form. I did go ahead and add hot glue as needed to the sides of the strips so that there were no visible gaps. If by chance the gaps was too big to fill just by gluing the strips together, I made smaller strips from the paper bags to fill them in. Here's how the wreath looked once I had all the paper strips glued into place. I used Rust-Oleum glossy spray paint in the color Real Orange and took the wreath outside and gave the front and back 2 good coats. To make the stem, once the pumpkin was completely dry, I cut one of the paper bag strips in half and wrapped it around the stem and twisted the end into the shape of a pumpkin stem. Once I was happy with the way the stem looked, I used hot glue to secure it in place at the bottom on the front and back of the pumpkin. Then to finish up this wreath, I took a few strands of raffia from a Dollar Tree hula skirt and wrapped it around the bottom of the stem, tied it in a simple shoestring bow, and used a dab of hot glue to hold it in place. I went ahead and trimmed up the tails of the bow, and this one is finished. I am super happy with how this wreath turned out. I love the rustic look and texture of the pumpkin and can't wait to add it to my decor. And last but not least, DIY number 6. For this project, I used 3 of these large chunky wooden ovals from Hobby Lobby. I used Minwax wood finish in the color red oak to stain the sides and backs of all 3 ovals. Next, I cut out an oval piece of faux cowhide fabric and 2 oval pieces of faux leather fabric that fit on the front of the ovals. To attach the fabric to the wooden oval, I applied a generous layer of Mod Podge to the front of the oval and placed the cowhide fabric on top. I smoothed out all the lumps and wrinkles and set it aside to dry for a few hours. I then repeated this step to adhere the faux leather fabric to the front of the other 2 wooden ovals. I also used one of these wooden finials from Hobby Lobby and stained it with Minwax wood finish in the color red oak. Once everything was completely dry, I used some hot glue to attach the 2 leather ovals together in the middle, making sure the bottoms were flush with one another. Next, I applied hot glue to the back side of the cowhide oval and placed it in the middle of the 2 leather ovals, again making sure the bottoms were all flush with each other so that the pumpkin stands on its own. Then I used hot glue to attach the finial to the top center of the cowhide oval to create the pumpkin stem. To finish off this pumpkin, I took some raffia from a Dollar Tree hula skirt and wrapped it around the bottom of the stem, tied it in a knot, and trimmed up the raffia, and this one is finished. I admit I'm a sucker for these types of wooden pumpkins, and then to throw in some faux cowhide and faux leather, yep, I'm sold. Here is one final look at all of today's pumpkin DIYs. I absolutely love how all these projects turned out and cannot wait to add them to my decor this year. Which one of these projects is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. As far as mine, I think I'm going to have to say it's a toss-up between the 2 pumpkin wreaths. Don't forget to go check out the Pumpkin Spice and Everything Nice playlist, as well as the channels of today's wonderful host. All of the links will be in the description box below. I want to thank each and every one of you for stopping by, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out here on YouTube, and if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a little while. I have tons of fun projects on the way. I'll see y'all next time.